So, good evening and welcome everybody to our Transatlantic Tuesday. Please make sure that you leave your microphones turned off to ensure the best sound quality possible. If you'd like to leave your cameras on, you can do so. My name is Friederike Schulte and I'm the director of the Karl Schurz House, and I have the pleasure of welcoming our distinguished guest tonight at our Transatlantic Tuesday series we started online in January and have pretty much continued every Tuesday since then. Welcome, Anne Applebaum.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
And you're not, I thought you would join us from Poland, but you are in Washington, D.C., so this is a transatlantic connection tonight. That's great. We've been hoping to invite you for a long time for a program to Freiburg and thought maybe Poland and the French border. It is far, but it's not as far as DC. But I'm glad it's happening now because we get to discuss this really elegant and thought-provoking book you've written. I'd like to introduce you briefly to our guest. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer for The Atlantic. Previously, she's written for over 17 years a column for the Washington Post. She's written for many other major American magazines as well. And in the 90s, she worked in the UK, starting at The Economist and then working at The Spectator for a number of years. She's published 3 critically acclaimed and award-winning books on Eastern European and Soviet history: Red Famine, Iron Curtain, and Gulag, which she received the Pulitzer Prize for. She lives in Poland and is married to the Polish politician and former Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski, who's now part of the European Parliament. And tonight we get to discuss her really quite extraordinary book, Twilight of American Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, which was published by Doubleday last summer in the US and in Britain by Penguin with a slightly different title. And just a couple of days ago, it came out in the German translation by Jürgen Neubauer im Siedler Verlag, and looks a bit harsh. And I do think this is the German premiere for a book talk you're doing. I think your book has been featured. I mean, I've seen it in Dreisat, Deutschlandfunk, and everywhere, but I think we get the pleasure to be the first ones. Is that right?
I think this is definitely one of the first ones. Yes, I have talked to some other German audiences in the last few months, but this is probably the first one following the German publication. Yes.
That's great. So no pressure. I'd like to make sure that we cover a bit of ground together, and then I'll see how much time we have and try to include some of your questions that you can pose in the chat if you'd like to, and that I will moderate to Anne Applebaum. We have a little less than 60 minutes, so I'd like to get started and lead us straight into the book. The book is filled with personal stories of people Anne Applebaum once knew well, and might have considered friends or considered friends, and who've left the central right conservative playing field to start out in what seems like almost different or a detached league of the far right conspiracy theorists building autocratic systems or being part of existing autocratic systems. I was going to say the novel. It's not a novel. It's very good writing. It's very strong storytelling as well. Starts with a very remarkable and memorable scene that keeps the whole book together. A New Year's Eve party Anne Applebaum and her husband were hosting in rural Poland in '99, going into the new millennium, celebrating with friends from London, Moscow, the US, and from the Polish countryside as well. And many of the friends there were journalists, some were politicians or diplomats, and all, as she said, lumped together under the loose term of anti-communists and conservatives. And now, 20 years later, as Anne Applebaum continues and says, I would now cross the street to avoid some of the people who were at my New Year's Eve party. They, in turn, would not only refuse to enter my house, they would be embarrassed to admit they'd even been there. In fact, about half the people who were at the party would no longer speak to the other half. And in the course of this book, a selection of the guests from that party and a few other characters are revisited by Anne Applebaum, either in person or in reflection from afar. And while musing about, or maybe more sharply analyzing the people who have wandered off to the far right, the readers learn about the countries, parties, or systems these people are now functioning in, may it be in the media, think tanks, or in state institutions. It's on the one hand a very personal, and thus I think without making the claims to it, but a very universal book, more so than a straight political essay would be, and maybe we'll get the chance to talk about this pretty unique format in the end as well. Thank you again for giving us the opportunity to speak with you today. You cover countries in this book that you either lived in, like England, or you live in Poland, or you stem from the US, or that you've visited and done research in, like Spain and Hungary. And you know, this is, I think you have such an interesting international CV that is not often obtained by many intellectuals. Like, there are more people in the corporate world that travel around that much. Maybe there are diplomats that do so, but they stay in their bubble. So you've lived in Poland for how long? More than 25 years?
So it depends what you mean by lived in. I first moved to Poland in the winter of 1988, which was right before the collapse of communism. And the first story that I wrote about from there was, it was actually a sort of remarkable moment. She arrived in furs and, you know, kind of Cossack boots, and, you know, went shopping in a what was then, you know, a unique free market, a sort of open shopping, you know, farmers market in central Warsaw, and generally said things are changing. And actually very soon after that, things did begin to change. I haven't lived there the whole time since then. I've gone back and forth, mostly between Poland and Britain, and then later on between Poland and the US. But I've really been attached to the country one way or another since then. So, so that's actually more than 30 years that I've either lived there or had property there, or, you know, and of course my husband's Polish. And so I you know, somehow feel connected to it for a very long time.
And I'm wondering about that Polish perspective that you can bring to the table here. I mean, you've written a lot about Poland for mainly a US audience, or Eastern Europe as well. But I'm wondering about that you saw the rise of the Law and Justice Party before Trump was elected as well. And did you did your Polish experience inform your way of looking at US politics maybe in 2015 as well, before the US election? And were you imagining that something similar would be possible in the US?
So yes, I should say that I became aware of the rise of a new kind of disinformation, and of you know, a more powerful form of far right and extreme politics because of being in Poland. And I was aware of it both because I understood the changes there that I think really begin, as I explained in the book, a few years earlier, in about 2010, following this plane crash of the president, which had a big shattering effect on Polish politics. I then watched very closely, I was somehow very closely involved in, because I was at the time writing a book about Ukraine, the experience of watching the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then trying to understand the Western reaction to it, understanding how Russian disinformation worked, and trying to shape views of that reaction. Even actually as a participant, I was involved in a lot of television and other debates at that time about what was going on there. And that was one of my first clues about the power of new forms of disinformation to confuse people. And it was really with that background and with an understanding of what could happen and how, that I started watching with really a lot of horror what was going on in the US, because so much of it was familiar and so much of it seemed like patterns I knew from other places. And so many of the tactics that were used by the Trump campaign were ones that I knew, you know, from other places and times, that I felt obligated to write about it. And actually all through 2016, you know, I know that I was one of the first people to start talking about the links between Trump and Russia, not in any conspiratorial way, but just in the way that the Trump campaign was using Russian-style propaganda and Russian-style tactics in order to beat Hillary Clinton. And of course, at that time, it seemed a little obscure. And I now wish I'd written it rather more definitively. I was very tentative about how I wrote about this because I didn't want to seem insane. But I do think that there was a turning point, and it did happen sometime in the first part of the second decade of the 21st century, when extremist movements learned how to use new social media tools. This is part of the story, of course, not all the story. And you could see that pattern repeating itself in lots of places. So I do think that having lived through it in Poland made it easier for me to recognize and to even predict some of the things happening in the US. I mean, just for another example, the way in which the Russian hack of the Democratic National Committee, if you remember this release of lots of emails, most of which were completely innocuous, people making appointments with one another and so on, and had some frank conversations between people. And the way those emails were then released to WikiLeaks, and then they were published online, and then there was a kind of feeding frenzy where people tried to interpret all kinds of things about them, and they were somehow used to scar the candidate, even though she had very little to do with them, was exactly the tactic that I'd seen used in Poland a few years earlier. And since it was directed at my husband and directed at his party, I knew it very well. In that case, it was tapes, equally innocuous, equally. I mean, no, there was no corruption involved. It was just the sound of people speaking privately, and I understood from that how the public use of private speech can be used to discredit people, even when there's no crime committed or there's nothing bad has happened. And so, having watched it in Poland and then seeing it repeat itself in the U.S. was very, it was very informative. So yeah, I do think it helped me see things, and maybe also just the longer, the years I spent writing books about the Soviet Union made me more hyper aware of the rhetoric of authoritarianism, the use of phrases like enemies of the people, the way in which political parties that attack, the system, as opposed to competing with their enemies over ideas, can be used to subvert democracy. This is something I knew from history as well.
You name one of these tactics, and I think it's with Timothy Snyder, you call them the middle-sized lies that the authoritarian systems are working with. Can you give an example or explain what the medium or middle-sized lie is?
So I was trying to think of a way to describe how the use of a certain kind of big falsehood functions. And what I meant was, when I say the medium-sized lie, these aren't normal lies, if you will have, these aren't politicians promising something they can't deliver, for example, nor are they big lies. This isn't a huge ideology with, predictions of the past and a whole economic theory attached to it. This isn't fascism, it's not communism. These are stories that are used to undermine public trust. The one that I talk about in the book was the one I've just referred to, which is there was a plane crash in Poland in 2010, killed the president. The president was he was a different political party from the government. And he was a member of the Law and Justice Party, which is now the ruling party. All of the evidence that's ever been collected about the plane crash has shown that it was an accident. Nevertheless, it became very useful for the Law and Justice Party, and particularly its leader, who happened to be the brother of the president. It was useful for them to turn this into a conspiracy theory about how unnamed forces, sometimes it was Russians, sometimes it was other Poles, sometimes it was the Polish government of the time, had been conspiring to make the plane crash. They never had any proof of it, even since they've been running the government for however many years it's been now, 6 years. They've never come up with an alternate theory. They don't have any evidence. Nevertheless, this crash story and the implication that there was something that had been was used by them as a way of gaining power. And what's interesting, of course, is how this worked. So the story, if you believe that the president was murdered, and he was murdered possibly with the connivance of the Polish government. That's a very powerful story, because what it means is that everyone is lying to you: the Polish government, the parliament, the police, the secret services, all of the media, the scientists, the aerospace in this accident. It suddenly implies that all these people are lying. And once you believe that all these people are lying, then you ask yourself, well, what's the value of this system? How can I believe anything if they've lied about something so important as who murdered the president? And so although it appeared like a conspiracy theory, something crazy, something like a third of Poles eventually came to believe in it. And I think that was the first step in moving people away from reality-based politics and into something quite different. For those of you who know US politics, birtherism, and namely, this was the conspiracy theory that Barack Obama was born somewhere else. He was born in Kenya, and therefore he was an illegitimate president, had a very, very similar function. And so what was birtherism? It meant that the president is illegitimate and everyone is covering it up. So the president, White House, Congress, police, CIA, the courts, everyone is covering up this fact that he shouldn't really be our president. And again, it's something 20 to 30% of Americans believe that too. If you believed that, then you were much more likely to follow a political leader who told you that the whole system was corrupt, because, evidently, we'd had one illegitimate president, then therefore the system, it must be all fake. And these kinds of lies, these major conspiracy theories that are used to unmoor people and to convince them that the political system is dysfunctional, have been used in a number of ways. I mean, a similar one in Hungary is the Soros conspiracy theory, that George Soros is secretly trying to overthrow the Hungarian state. He's trying to destroy Hungary by importing Muslims into the country so that he can so that Hungarians will disappear eventually. So each one of these kinds of theories has the effect of making people distrust the political system, and they work. And it's always a bad idea to underestimate them. I know that in Germany there are one or two. There are conspiracy theorists there too, and I know right now it's a much smaller percentage of the population. But it's a force that really should never be underestimated, because, again, if you believe that the whole system is corrupt, if you believe that the president is illegitimate, if you believe the president was murdered, if you believe that, Angela Merkel is locking down the economy because she has a secret plan to undermine Germany, if you believe one of those things, then you are much likely to follow an authoritarian or an anti-democratic leader at some point in the future.
Mm-hmm. We had a talk here by two specialists on conspiracy theorists talking about QAnon, and they said it's not necessarily the number of people has increased that believes in conspiracy theories, but the people who do believe in them more strongly. So there's a deeper rift, although I do believe that more people believe in it. I think birtherism is a really important breaking point also for breaking point for parts of the Republican Party. And then if we look at what's happening now, it's Stop the Steal is, of course, another lie that is a bit more than.
Well, I mean, if you think about them, they're both very similar in that they are attacks on the democratic system. So the President Obama was illegitimate, not that he's wrong or I disagree with him or I think his healthcare policy is bad. He's actually illegitimate. The system has failed because we have an illegitimate president. That leads you quite naturally into a belief that the electoral system is a lie, it doesn't work, it can be manipulated. And then once again, Joe Biden is not really the president, he's illegitimate. So these are linked ideas.
Yeah. Let's talk about who is helping to spread the middle-sized lies. That's another theme that runs through the book, the theme of the clerk or the clerks, the enablers of the autocratic systems or movements, the writers, thinkers, intellectuals that maybe started out with I don't know, purest intentions, but nonetheless feed the autocratic regimes. Can you explain the term with all its connotations, and maybe we can move into some of the motivations behind this kind of writing or enabling that the clerks do? Like you mentioned, different forms of nostalgia for the restoring of a former world, or maybe even personal or national disappointment that comes into play.
So yes, I used the word clerks, which I borrowed from a French writer, Julien Benda, who was writing the first half of the 20th century, and he was trying to describe, a slightly different, related phenomenon of intellectuals who had become spokespeople for extremist political parties, and he was writing about France at this time and some other Europeans. And he was talking about them being both attracted to the far left and the far right. And he made a famous prediction, namely that, this was all going to end badly and probably in a war. And of course, that's what happened. And his book, while it's about a different period, was helpful to me to understand reasons why intellectuals, critics, people whose job is to be skeptical might become attracted to extremist politics. And it also helped me understand some of the people around me who I saw had felt that kind of attraction. And then you're right. And then the book doesn't have, there's no single explanation. I don't give you one theory that will explain everything, which I think has frustrated some of the readers of the book and some of the reviewers. Instead, I give a range of explanations and I examine a few people's life stories just to give an illustration. And you're right. I mean, probably the thing that unites everybody who I write about is this, as you say, sense of disappointment. And sometimes it's personal. Some people felt that, there are people who felt that the post-communist democratic Poland hadn't rewarded them enough. They were, they'd been activists in the opposition in the 1980s, and somehow they didn't get to be what they wanted to be in the 20 years following that. And they found radical niches to attach themselves in order to change that calculus. Some people it was more philosophical. Some people were disappointed with their countries. And I write a little bit about, for example, a philosopher who I really admired for a lot of reasons, Roger Scruton, who I knew quite well, who died about a year ago, who was someone who had become very disappointed and dismayed by modern England. And he felt that it no longer lived up to wasn't the same kind of country that it had been. A certain kind of English way of life, English values had been lost. And when you come to believe that your country is dead or dying, which Roger did believe, that's another thing that pushes you in the direction of radicalism. Because if it's dead or dying, then anything that you can do, however radical or extreme, might be a way to save it. If the system is that bad, then the only thing you can do is wreck it and start again with something else. And actually, Roger was really one of the philosophers who inspired a lot of the Brexiteers, although a lot of the Brexiteers had different motives too, as I also explain in the book. So I think those are, people who were disappointed, people who were profoundly distressed either by the state of their country or in some cases by their own lives. I think those are the people who begin to find very radical politics attractive.
Mm-hmm. I think you mentioned the word that people were looking for, the rupture, and I think that's what all these movements have in common. And they have that, I mean, that's a term from the Christian evangelical movement that they're looking, isn't that the word? They're looking for the rupture, or that's the moment where everything turns around, the kind of apocalypse that...
That's a little different. I mean, that's the rapture. That's when
rapture.
The world ends and the Messiah comes. So I think I'm not quite talking about that.
But it perfectly fits.
But there is an idea. I mean, and this is not new. I mean, the Bolsheviks had the same idea, which is that if we smash up everything, the society that we build following that will be better. And so the idea that, what Washington really needs is for someone to come in and wreck it, and that will then make everything better. Yeah, this is where that idea came from. And there was I don't think, Trump himself was never, was a cynic and a con man. And so he didn't think that way exactly, but there were certainly intellectuals around Trump who thought that way. We know he's a con man. We know he doesn't know what he's doing. We know he has no experience, but that's why we want him in charge, because he's going to smash it all up. And once it's all smashed up, then that will be the moment when we can somehow come in and take over. And that was that was their rationale for supporting them. And even many very clever people supported him on those grounds.
Yeah, if we go back to the Brexit for a moment, and maybe Boris Johnson, who is of course a very unique character, and you know him personally, and you can say that he used to be one of the clerks writing up the struggle of the European Union in Britain, and finding these witty titles. And you also use the word tall tales instead of lies, which I think is very finely chosen, because it seems like it's a privileged person tells a tall tale instead of a lie, and it's fine. And I feel like, where is there disappointment in the character of Boris Johnson, or is this kind of like a bit of a sick joke in which the need for witty banter turns into Brexit eventually?
So Boris, I would not call a clerk. I would put him in a slightly different category. So I don't think he's an intellectual who was attracted to radical destruction. I think he is somebody who is just supremely self-interested, and what he saw was a moment when he could use this radical movement, which had which had a lot of grassroots support, that he could use it to become head of his party. I don't think he particularly believed in Brexit or thought that it had reasons to think it would be a success. In fact, I know he didn't think that, because as I say in the book, I heard him say exactly the opposite a few years just before. He used criticism of the EU as a tool to become popular and to become a figure in part of the Tory party. Was deeply committed to it in any way. I think he was surprised when the referendum went the way that it did. And I think that ever since then, he realized that his whole career and, the way he's remembered by history and, and everything else then depended on him somehow executing Brexit. So he then was stuck with doing it. But was he I don't think he was a true believer of any kind. Tall tales is interesting. I mean, so Boris is just to say that I think I do say in the book a couple of times that he did lie, but he's certainly been lying a lot recently. But what he did regarding the EU is a little bit different. If you look at if you look at the kind of journalism that he wrote in the 90s, when he was the Daily Telegraph's correspondent in Brussels, he very often took a story that had a grain of truth. So there would be some EU decision, or there would be there would be some law passed, and he would then elaborate on it so that it turned it into, Brussels is banning, British buses or something. He would turn the story into something that was more crowd pleasing. And actually that method of writing, in which you take a story and manipulate it, is something that is now so common that we've all lost, we've all lost our ability to detect it. But he was very good at kind of dissembling without lying for a long time. I think since he's been prime minister, he now is very often just simply untruthful. But anyway, just to conclude what you said.
Yeah. Well, if we continue on that train of thought about like a truthfulness in today's politics and in media, I'd like to revisit, like, you know, the Reagan era for Germany is of course vastly important because it is part of reunification, and we know Reagan saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," which John Korblum wrote for him, who's still important for us here in Germany, the former ambassador. But the Reagan era in your book is the departure point as well. For the sake of structure of the book, it really works well, and I guess because of real conviction as well, that it was a better time back then. But if we look at, like, if you look back in hindsight now, didn't the Reagan era pave the way for, of course, some of the rhetoric, we know that, for the Trump administration with the slogans that are referring to Reagan or simply borrowed, but also with the giving up of the fairness doctrine under Reagan when it comes to broadcasting, and you know, isn't that, aren't we harvesting some of the decisions from back then today?
Yeah, so this is a complicated, I mean, this is a question that historians run into all the time. I mean, from what era led to which? I mean, look, the Reagan era conservative party, I mean, Republican Party, sorry, just like the Reagan era Democratic Party, was a big coalition. And there were a lot of people in it for different reasons. And in fact, let me make it a broader statement. The anti-communist Cold War coalition in America was a very broad coalition, and people were in it for different reasons. And some people were Reaganites or Cold Warriors because they worried about raison d'etat and Soviet nuclear weapons and the division of Germany, and therefore, therefore they were inside that camp. Some people were Cold Warriors because they were very religious and they believed that Marxism was atheist, and that's why we have to fight against it, because it's, we need to make the world a more religious place. Some people were in it because they believed in human rights and democracy, and organizations like Amnesty International grow out of that time, in that era as well. What happened after the end of communism, after 1989, and especially after the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, is that coalition began to discover that actually not all of us had that much in common. Actually the human rights people and the religious people didn't really agree about much else, or the raison d'etat people then split into different camps, because they then saw the US's and Western foreign policy in different ways. And so the big group that was sort of together no longer made sense. And if you look back at the Reagan era, of course you can find seeds of things that have gone wrong in the present. So you can find some of the so-called Southern strategy of the Republican Party, which was to, without saying so, to try and reach whites in the South, in the Southern states. This was a feature of the Reagan era and also of other Republican presidents. You can find, as you say, the destruction of the fairness doctrine, which was one of the things that kept media more centrist in America. But you can also find other things, and so some of the things that we like about the president also find in the past. So I don't think you can. I don't think you can draw straight lines. I mean, George W. Bush became president, and as somebody who was very much committed to racial equality. He had a special program, he had a special, spent a lot of time thinking about Africa, which no president really has since, even Obama. He had a big, he was very keen on eradicating AIDS in Africa. He spent a lot of money on that. Some of that came from his evangelical background. And so you can see different kinds of policies in the past. So yes, of course, you're right that you can find, stories of the Reagan era that echo into the present, but you can also find, the origins of a lot of human rights organizations in that same era and in some of the same ways of thinking. So I'm reluctant to blame Reagan for everything, although of course I wouldn't excuse Reagan either. I mean, of course there were a lot of bad things that happened during his presidency, and just as there were a lot of, as I said, many of the people who were part of that Reaganite coalition have gone in very radically different directions.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering about like that. I think around the time of I think Fox News was started in 1996, I think, by Rupert Murdoch, and Roger Ailes came in, and I think it must have been an interesting talking point for you at that New Year's Eve party as well in '99. What do you remember how you were watching the growth of Fox News back then? And what you were thinking?
We were not talking about Fox News at my New Year's Eve party in 1999. No, I mean, I don't think Fox News was big on my radar in 1999. I mean, you know, Fox News for a long time, it was conservative without seeming insane. I mean, maybe you know, and this I would have to, you're asking me a question that I haven't thought about very deeply. I mean, I would now have to go back and watch broadcasts from the late 90s and early 2000s. But I didn't initially perceive it as an authoritarian news station, which I do perceive it as now. And even if you look at somebody like Laura Ingraham, who I do write about in the book, if you look at the kinds of things she was saying and writing about 10 years ago, she's now a leading Fox News host for those who don't know her. She wasn't that far away from the mainstream or whatever you want to call it. She wasn't, you know, she would have been able to talk to Democrats in a civilized way, and there would have been you know, her views on foreign policy weren't off the cliff crazy. But there is something that's happened to Fox News, I think, you know, in the last 5 to maybe even 10 years, which has led it in a radically different direction. And you can even see, I mean, you know, I used to be on Fox News occasionally. I mean, they would invite me as a commentator, and I would never be invited now. So there's and that's true of lots of, you know, there are lots of moderates and centrists and even, you know, Democrats who would regularly have appeared on Fox News who've been banished. So it's become something, you know, under the influence of Trump, frankly, and under the influence of the modern Republican Party. And because they've worked out that this kind of hyper emotional, you know, super biased broadcasting wins them a lot of viewers, because, you know, and so for commercial reasons, obviously, I think it's become something much more extreme than it was. But again, I mean, I've not thought about it, and I haven't gone to look at what Fox News was saying in 2001. I would have to do that before being able to fully answer the question.
Well, but that already is an answer, so it's not that it wasn't that relevant at the time. But I think I just someone forwarded something in my social media feed to me about media literacy today. Can I tell an opinion piece apart from news reporting? And if we apply such a standard to a place like Fox News, we're lost, of course. And at the same time, we're living in a time where Lindsey Graham can give absolutely like a lunatic appearances in interviews and talk about dark magic that the former president has maybe over him, and still keep his seat. And I am wondering like where we are concerning truthfulness and liable positions that politicians take on, reliable positions that the public can rely on as well. It's not a real, I mean, it's hard. It's not even a real question. It's just a frustration.
Well, it's not a real question. I mean, it's the central problem of our age.
Yeah.
What do we do about the huge, overwhelming quantity of information? How do we find our way through it? Who are the authorities that we should trust? You know, whose views should you believe? You know, and there isn't a single satisfying answer. I mean, I've been working recently. I've just written something that appeared in the Atlantic a couple of weeks ago about how we might think about regulating the internet, by which I don't mean censoring the internet. I mean regulating it, so that so that it was a positive contribution to democracy rather than something that undermined democracy. And that's one of the things we might think about doing. But I mean, ultimately, you know, a lot of this is a question of trust. I mean, you have to, if you care about, you know, if you care about finding the truth, you know, you need to, you should, you need to look at what is it that you're reading. Is what you're reading self-correcting, you know, because everybody writes, everybody makes mistakes, especially now with the speed at which news is produced. And, are you reading publications that correct themselves? Are you reading publications that present, you know, a broad range of views or give you different perspectives on a current problem? Are you reading a publication where they're editors and where they do fact checking and where they at least seek to make sure that something is true, even though, again, as I said, everybody makes mistakes. And I mean, I think nowadays one of the qualities of being a citizen is reading like that, seeking out, you know, better edited and better researched writing, which is, you know, but I concede it's one of the most difficult problems that we have.
I think I really want to recommend that article in the Atlantic. It's called How to Put Out Democracy's Dumpster Fire, and it's going to appear in the April issue, and it's going to be in our library right behind me as soon as it's April. And I think the book has a certain gloom about it, but I think that article doesn't, and it's really offering a lot of perspectives on how algorithms could be regulated, how online initiatives could help form a better discourse that I found really uplifting to read, I have to say.
Well, it was actually, I mean, one of the things that happened after the election was over and we got through January the 6th and all that, one of the things I wanted to do was write something positive, and write something that threw many of these arguments forward. Okay, we have this, you know, we have these enormous problems. How can we start to think about fixing them? But of course, it's a complicated conversation.
Do you think there's a way back for some people that you write about, like that you used to have your party with? Is there a way back for them into the more democratic system, or back to your dinner table at some point?
Sort of depends who. I mean, I have plenty of Brexiteer friends who I'm still friends with. So, I mean, there were different kinds of breaks in different countries. I mean, there's some Trumpists who may eventually conclude that following the president was a mistake. There were some Brexiteers who might eventually conclude that was wrong. Maybe some of the Polish far right will come over. Although, I mean, there's a difference here between the kinds of people I'm writing about in the book, who are usually intellectuals or journalists or kind of political strategists, and ordinary voters. This is, to be clear, this is not a book about voters. It's not about why people voted for Trump. Some reviewers have wished that it was about that, but that's not what it was about. And there's a difference between voters who I think are very good at seeing when the mistakes have been made and seeking to correct them, and people who've devoted their lives to a particular political cause. I think that gets much harder to walk back from. And whether they will all be able to do it, I don't know. I mean, we may wind up with them sticking to it to the bitter end, just because, as I said, Boris Johnson, once he discovered that Brexit was his destiny, and that he was attached to it forevermore, he was going to carry it through. And as I said, I have no idea what he thinks about it now, or how he thinks about it in his head, but he now has, it's almost as if he has no choice. I mean, one of the things that, just as an aside, that I'm now starting to worry about is that Brexit will never end, in that the need for the Tory party to continually show that UK is good and Europe is bad in whether it's in vaccines or in trade, or, may continue to drive the relationship between Britain and Europe for a long time, which is unfortunate, because of course there should be cooperation, and of course there should be a joint foreign policy, and of course there should be a rational conversation about trade and so on, and it should continue evolving. But one of the things I'm concerned about is the number of people whose political careers and whose journalistic careers now depend on keeping that struggle going. And for that reason, it might last for an unfortunately long time.
I'm going to include one question from the chat that includes how people are feeling and is related to maybe this this whole idea also about nostalgia or disappointment. How important for understanding the alienation many people feel towards the establishment is the psychological problem that some susceptible people feel that they don't receive enough acknowledgement or respect from society at large for one reason or another.
Oh, I mean, that's a problem that afflicts people at all levels of society. I mean, one of the things, it may even be the only thing about Donald Trump that was truly authentic, that was not fake and was not a con and was not cynical, was his sense of personal grievance. They're talking down to me. They don't respect me, whatever it was. The New York elite didn't, or the journalists, at the New York Times, aren't respecting me enough. And his sense of grievance that I have been unfairly treated. I really won the election, but they've stolen it from me. Or I really, I'm not being given credit. This sense was one of the things that I think, again, this is not the subject of my book, but it's one of the things that did attract a lot of people, both at the high level and all the way down through society. That people who felt unfairly, what I'm doing isn't being respected. My achievements aren't acknowledged. The kind of job I do isn't favored by whoever, by Hollywood or by Harvard, or the kind of person I am isn't favored. I mean, all these things were all these kinds of people, I think, found something to be attracted to in Trump, because it was really this serious grievance that he transmitted more than anything else. If you listen to his speeches, they're very rambling and hard to listen to. But if you do, that theme comes up again and again and again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also want to, we have just a couple of minutes, but talk about the form of the book. I really love the American publication and the size of it. It's really elegant, like it fits into a clutch, but has kind of the power of a little hand grenade. I find that, I have to say, if someone's watching from the German publisher, they really should have done the same. And it has a really literary quality to it as well. It's a really great read. Yasha Monk said it's like a beach read. I wouldn't necessarily say that, but it did remind me of my first lockdown read, and I just grabbed about a year ago The Book and the Brotherhood by Iris Murdoch. And it starts off with a very similar situation. It's a reunion of former Oxford students. They get together. The New York Times wrote a reviews about that book, Lefties in Love. This is not Lefties in Love, I guess, but it's a very similar scenario, and it's about forces at work where a group of friends is drawn apart by different, I think, also political ideas, basically, and that was a nice side note for me while reading it. I want to ask you, how did it feel daring to write it like this, or did you always know that your stories that you can share would have to be told in such a fashion?
So, I mean, first of all, the book is an essay. It's not a big book. It's not, as I said, there's no big thesis that I've proven with lots of data. It's just reflections on people I know. And I think the decision to write it, which first of all, part of it appeared earlier as an article also in The Atlantic, but the original decision to write it was based on the fact that I realized I had lived through something that was important, this big intellectual shift, that I had sort of seen it firsthand, and I'd seen it happen to people around me. And I felt that it needed an explanation. And this isn't the explanation that some 10 years from now historian will write. There will be a historian who writes, I don't know, the intellectual history of the second decade of the 21st century. And that will be a different book, and there will be different points of view, and maybe my view will be one among many. But I felt that I had this ringside seat. I had this, special view of something. And I had it in particular in these three countries, in the US and the UK and Poland, as well as Hungary and Spain, and actually even Germany and France, where I didn't wind up writing about them, but I saw something similar happening in all these countries. And I felt that because I'd seen this change, I could write about it in the first person, which I don't normally do, or I didn't used to do. And that was the reason for it. Just because there was no honest way for me to write this book as an objective journalist or as a historian. I'm in the story, I'm part of it. I know the people, some of it has affected me in various different ways, which I also describe in the book. And to pretend that I was some kind of, unattached outsider would have just been dishonest. So I felt that I'd seen this thing, it was important. And I thought the way I could explain it was by talking about things that I remember and reflecting on them and trying to relate them to other stories from other eras.
I think it's a great read, and it's a wonderful perspective. And I hope you don't mind me saying that you and David Frum are the closest we can get on stage, closest to a Republican we can get on stage, because we don't get Republicans on stage at this German-American Institute. We've been trying, we have around 250 events a year and are always looking for a conservative perspective, and it's very, very hard to find. And so I think this is very important to hear your point of view, and it's been very fruitful for everyone. And I promise you that we would start 5 off, and I'm doing pretty good, I think, right?
Very excellent. Thank you very much. Next time I hope to be there. I miss meeting readers and would love to be in Freiburg. So.
We'll definitely invite you. And I want to thank the audience for taking part. Next time we'll take more questions again. And next Tuesday, please join us. Tori Tausig from Harvard University will talk about China and the US. And in April, we'll talk about George Soros and Jewish America. Hari Kunzru, Red Pill will be a great reading. Thank you very much. And Applebaum, I hope is it cherry blossom time?
Just about. The first cherry blossoms are just about coming out, yes.
Okay. Well, all the best to you in DC and to your family. And thanks so much.
So much. Best wishes, and I hope this terrible pandemic ends quickly. So thank you. Thanks, bye.
Don't we all? Thank you. Bye-bye.